Thank you very much, Judy, for the kind introduction. I'd, of course, like to take this opportunity to thank Judy and Liz and the entire staff here at Radcliffe for this wonderful opportunity to be a part of such a fantastic community of scholars and artists and writers. This has really been wonderful for me and for my project. I especially appreciate the congenial tone of all of our discussions in this forum and also in our private seminars. Thank you very much for that. And I've had a lot of discussions with some of the fellows here and some of the colleagues during this initial time here, and I get the sense that a number of you have been a little bit traumatized by Hegel due to some experience you've had as an undergraduate, perhaps. And I understand that sense of trauma. I want to ask you today to bear with me for just a little bit here and see if I can present to you a picture of Hegel which is perhaps a bit more intelligible and a bit more interesting, perhaps a bit more compelling than the one that you were presented with before. So I enjoin you just to put aside for a moment whatever bad memories you might have or whatever picture of Hegel you might have had in your mind up until now, and let's see if we can start over again. During Hegel's tenure in Berlin from 1818 until his death in 1831, he delivered his lecture course on the philosophy of religion 4 times in 1821, 1824, 1827, and 1831. In these lectures, Hegel's ostensibly trying to make a case for the truth of Christianity, which is more or less what we would expect from somebody who's a professor at the main university in Prussia during the 1820s. It makes perfect sense. I think we have to recall that during this time in the Kingdom of Prussia, there didn't exist freedom of religion as we know it today. It was straightforwardly illegal to call into question any of the key points of Christian dogma. And Hegel had seen some of his own colleagues unceremoniously fired for having appeared to have done things of that sort. Everything that Hegel published during this time, he had to submit to the Prussian censors for their approval first. So sometimes Hegel's often caricatured as a prototypical Prussian philosopher who's writing in defense of the Prussian state, but this is a complete misunderstanding. This is one of the many Hegel myths that one will find sometimes in the secondary literature. Hegel himself was not a Prussian. He was born in Stuttgart. He came from the Duchy of Württemberg, which at the time was, of course, a completely different country with its own customs and tradition. Hegel himself was always a foreigner in Prussia, and his students often noted his thick Württembergian accent, and his colleagues sometimes tended to snub him or to exclude him from noble society because of this. Now, while Hegel's stated goal in these lectures is to defend the truth of Christianity, in my project I submit that if we read between the lines, we can see, in fact, he's engaged in a project which is much more ambitious and in some ways more interesting. He notes that human beings have worshipped the divine in virtually every form imaginable. So anything at all can be and has been reverenced as a god or a divinity. And this at first glance can appear very confusing. I know when I teach students introduction to mythology, the first time they hear about the Greek myths, they can't make any sense of it at all. It strikes them as very strange when they hear these stories about the Greek gods and goddesses and all the things they're doing. It doesn't seem to make any sense whatsoever to them. So Hegel's deeper project is to try to discern some rationality, some logic, some logos in this apparently chaotic manifold of myths, beliefs, and religious practices. He wants to find some basic principles that can help us to understand why it is that humans conceive of the gods in the way that they do. And so when I talk about the logic of the gods in my title, this is what I'm talking about. Hegel wants to help us understand this logos, this rationality. The first edition of Hegel's Lectures on the Philosophy of Religion was published in 1832, just a few months after Hegel's death. It was edited by one of his students, this guy, Philipp Marheinecke, who was a theologian. And what Marheinecke did is he simply went around and asked his fellow students if they had lecture notes to these lectures that Hegel had given through the years. He got those together, combined them, and collated them to make a single running text. And so when we talk about Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of religion, we're not strictly speaking about talking about a text by Hegel's own hand. Right? These are student notes which have been put together in different ways, and the philology of this is extremely complex. I won't go into it, but take it from me that this is a complex matter, and different editions follow different principles. A long story. But it was this initial edition by Mar Heinecke in 1832 which played a crucial role in the history of reception, since it was really the focal point for the critical debates surrounding Hegel's philosophy. In many ways, it was the key text that caused the split among Hegel's followers that created the schools known to the history of philosophy as right and left Hegelianism. Again, we don't need to get into the details of that. But suffice it to say that the debates about Hegel's philosophy of religion defined philosophy and theology in the German-speaking world in the 1830s and 40s. And so this was a text that was read by thinkers such as Ludwig Feuerbach, David Friedrich Strauss, Karl Marx, Bruno Bauer, Soren Kierkegaard. It was all of the important figures of that period read this text carefully, and it played an important role for them. Now, the basic structure of these lectures follows a threefold scheme, right? For Hegel, everything's about threes, right? We start with the concept of religion, and then the section, the determinate religion, or sometimes translated the definite religion. This is the one we'll look at in more detail. And then finally, what he calls the absolute religion, or the consummate religion in another translation. The first section now, the concept of religion. Here Hegel explores the nature of God in the abstract. So the idea is that God is a concept, right? And each different field for him corresponds to a specific concept. So God is the concept that corresponds to the field of religion in the same way that, for example, beauty is the concept that corresponds to art or aesthetics, or in the way that justice would be the concept that corresponds to law. And so here Hegel wants to explore, what do we mean intuitively when we use this word God or the divine? What is that as a concept to us? So independent of any concrete religion or any religious tradition, just what does that term mean? So that's what he's occupied with in that first section. Then in the second section, he moves from that abstract conception to the concrete conceptions. So he wants to look at all the different religions of the world and see concretely how have those different religions conceived of the divine in different ways. And so here he gives this long story about the development of the world religions. And at the beginning of each chapter, he tries to say, what does that religion understand by God? What is the concept of the divinity in that religion? And so here you can see that we can understand the concept of religion as representing the universal, right? What is God as a general concept, and then the determinate religion representing the particular, right? So looking at individual conceptions of God. Then he thinks that the third section, the absolute religion, this is his defense of Christianity, where he thinks these two come together. In the historical story he wants to tell, it's leading up to Christianity, and this is the Hegel's Christian apologist part that we will return to. And the middle section, the determinate religion, is where it gets a little more complex. He divides this into two large sections: the natural religion, the religions of nature, and the religions of spirit. Each of the world religions is determined and organized for him in accordance with its specific conception of what the divine is. And so the movement that Hegel wants to trace is intended to be a progressive one, starting with the most basic, moving to the most complex. To use his language, he has a kind of a funny way of putting this, that human beings are emerging from nature, right, as they're slowly developing different aspects of human culture. And so his question, you can understand it as being, how did human beings get from certain early conceptions of the gods to the conceptions that we have today? I guess in the same way, I suppose, anthropologists ask, how do we get from stone tools to whatever, rocket ships or computers? So in the first category, the natural religion, the divine is conceived of as an object of nature. So anything at all, like the sun, the moon, a river, an animal, a plant, anything of this sort would fall for him under the category of the philosophy of nature. In contrast to that, we have the religions of spirit. And on these accounts, right, the conception of the God is as a self-conscious agent or entity. It's an anthropomorphic conception. These are the forms of polytheism we see, for example, in the Greek and Roman religion. In the secondary literature on this, there's quite a number of books that treat Hegel as a Christian apologist, right? So many theologians just go to that final section and they ignore everything else. But I think this is a mistake, because this section on the determinate religion, which has really been quite neglected, is compelling in many ways. But I think what has stood in the way of people looking at this more seriously is what we call in Hegel's studies, Hegel's teleology. That is, this end toward which the development is progressing, or to put a finer point on it, his Eurocentrism. Right? We're all leading up to Christianity, and everything looks like it's subordinated to that. And so most of these studies on Hegel's philosophy of religion, they want to skip over that part and just see what he says about Christianity, and not worry so much about this uncomfortable question of telos. And of course, that's understandable. It's quite unfashionable to talk like that today. Nobody wants to say that the history of or development of world religions leads up to a culminating point in Christianity, which is the only true religion. I mean, that offends our modern sensibilities. And so, yeah, understandably, people have shied a little bit away from this topic. But I think what I want to suggest is that the matter's not quite so straightforward. I think when we hear this claim about the end of religion in Hegel, that conjures up in our minds a great number of things about, okay, what a person who would think that must have thought. And what I want to submit to your judgment here is that in Hegel's case, this is not the case. That our modern sensibilities simply do not square with the sensibilities at that time. And let me give you 3 quick reasons for why I think that. The first is that Hegel devotes a great deal of time and effort to understanding these other world religions, and it's perfectly clear that he doesn't think that because those are not the culminating religions that they're simply meaningless or worthless. On the contrary, he's extremely engaged in this, in exploring those other religions. And far from dismissing it, at the beginning of his lectures, Hegel actually warns his auditors about prejudice towards this material. And this is what he says. I mean, imagine this, like the first day of the semester at the University of Berlin, and all these excited students come in and for Hegel's lectures, and Hegel's attentive to this issue, right? And so he says this just as a caveat right at the very beginning of the lectures. He says it's undoubtedly true that the definite religions of the various peoples often enough exhibit the most distorted and confused ideas of the divine being, and likewise of duties and relations expressed in worship. But, right, here's the key point, we must not treat the matter so lightly and conceive of it in a superficial manner as to reject these ideas and these rites as superstition, error, and deceit. On the contrary, something higher is necessary, namely to recognize the meaning, the truth, and the connection with truth. In short, to get to know what is rational in them. They are human beings who hit upon such religions, therefore there must be reason in them, and amidst all that is accidental in them, a higher necessity. Yeah, we can see here that Hegel, it's very easy to read over this kind of a passage, but I think we need to put this in its historical context. And when you do, you see this is actually quite striking. Let's remember now, this is the time when Europe was just beginning for the first time to learn at all about these different non-European religions. And this process, as we all know, was accompanied with a great deal of suspicion, a great deal of ignorance, and a great deal of prejudice, right? And so some of which Hegel presumably saw in his own classroom. And so here he is right at the beginning of his lectures, admonishing his students to put aside their prejudice and to take a serious look at this material. Right? There's an inherent rationality in religious belief and practice, regardless of how odd or how foreign it might strike us or our intuitions at first glance. Although there's a teleology in the development of that religion, Hegel's not implying here that everything prior to that is simply meaningless. On the contrary, he's making a plea, which at the time was quite progressive, for a careful study of the non-European religions. A second point that follows along with this is if you look at the field of the philosophy of religion in his time, It was, as one would expect, extremely Eurocentric. If you look at, spend a lot of time on this, but just briefly, look at the philosophy of religion of his immediate predecessors, the philosophers Kant and Fichte. If you look at their philosophy of religion, it's all about the Judeo-Christian tradition. They basically never talk about any other religion. I mean, it's extremely limited. So for them, philosophy of religion, it's about understanding the Christian tradition by and large. Whereas for Hegel, is really sort of the first one to have made a conscious effort to include these non-European religions, right? And to really take them seriously and make that a central part of the discussion. And this is particularly striking when I look at, even to this very day, how Eurocentric this field is, right? And so in this sense as well, Hegel seems to be on the progressive side of things during his own time. And the third point I wanted to bring up has to do with Hegel's relationship to this guy, Georg Friedrich Kreutzer. Kreutzer was important in the rise of Asian studies in the German states at the time. From 1810 to 1812, he published in 4 volumes this book, Symbolic und Mythologie der alten Völker, besonders der Griechen, right? Symbolism and Mythology of the Ancient Peoples, especially the Greeks. This was an important and extremely controversial book at the time. Kreutzer began his studies in Jena in the 1790s, and in 1804 was appointed to a professorship in philology and ancient history at the University of Heidelberg. There he became known as one of the leading figures of Heidelberg Romanticism. Through his contact with the other romantics in this circle, Kreutzer, although originally a classicist by training, he became quite interested in the mythology of India and other Eastern religions. And this was the beginning of the inspiration for his book. And Kreutzer's approach to religion foreshadowed Hegel's in a lot of important ways. He saw a general development in history of the different world religions. And he saw them as developing from earlier stages to later ones, and he saw different beliefs and cults being transferred from one culture to another, and then being reshaped in different ways. And Kreutzer's comparative mythology attempted to demonstrate that there were important aspects of Greek mythology which originally came from Eastern sources, such as Egypt, Persia, and India. And this called into question the importance and originality of Greek culture, which the traditionalists, of course, had long celebrated. And this was a highly controversial claim at the time. This was the period of neoclassicism, right, of Philhellenism in the German states. And Kreutzer's views seemed to completely undermine what was the assumed superiority or primacy of Western culture, and to raise these Eastern religion to a new elevated status. This book set off quite a testy controversy that took place during the time when Hegel was lecturing in Berlin. And Kreutzer's views were simply rejected, and there were attempts to portray him as kind of a fanatic or an incompetent scholar. There was an enormous degree of resentment built up among the classicists that Kreutzer had, in a certain sense, betrayed his own background as a classical philologist. And they regarded his enthusiasm for ancient India as like high treason, right? They had no patience for this at all. Hegel knew Kreutzer personally. They were colleagues when Hegel was at Berlin from 1816 to 1818. That was immediately before he went to, they were colleagues in Heidelberg immediately before Hegel went to Berlin. Hegel's first biographer, Karl Rosenkranz, especially emphasized Hegel's sympathy for Kreutzer during this Heidelberg period. And this relationship is attested to in a number of different letters that Hegel writes to Kreutzer while he's in Berlin and while he's giving lectures. And he tells him quite openly how inspired he is by his book and how he's making use of them in his lectures. And Hegel says this also explicitly in the lectures, in the manuscripts that we have. And this is also something we have to fully appreciate the force of these passages. You have to put it in the historical context, where imagine, again, all of this controversy going on in the background. Everybody in the classroom knows who this guy Kreutzer is, and they know he's under fire because of all these philologists who are mad at him, right? And then there's Hegel. He's saying, my friend Kreutzer says this, and I think he's right. At the time, enormously, right, contentious thing to say. Right? So one of these passages one could easily read right over if you're not familiar with the historical background. But here Hegel's clearly taking a stand on Kreutzer's side of the argument. And Kreutzer was a major influence, I think, on Hegel's understanding and general approach to religion. In particular, he gave Hegel a greater appreciation for the religions of the East. And this then drew Hegel into these contemporary controversies surrounding the value and the status of this newly discovered material. Hegel's often known to be a great critic of the Romantics, but he was also sympathetic to their attempt to understand the deeper meaning of the Asian religions. Both Hegel and Kreutzer, they wanted to trace the links between the different world religions and to establish a continuous development from the religions of the East through the Greeks and the Romans. And on this score, in contrast to many scholars then, and for that matter now, Hegel, he doesn't have any problems with the suggestion that key aspects of Greek culture and religion came from Egypt, and key aspects of Egyptian culture and religion came from, for example, Mesopotamia or from Ethiopia, right? And he's quite open to these sorts of connections. And so all of this is simply to show that, right, it may be the stated goal of Hegel's lectures is to defend Christianity, but there's a lot more there than what we would immediately take to be implied in that simple claim. He has an enormous interest in this other material and is also keen to give it a philosophical analysis. Okay, well, what is the theory here? I hope this doesn't bring back bad memories from your undergraduate days. For Hegel, religion operates at the level of what he calls spirit. Right? By this, he simply means human culture, anything that is the product of the human mind. So the gods are the product of the collective human mind. They're not the idiosyncratic result of specific individuals. And so this means that when we're talking about religion, that the different religions follow different nationalistic lines. So it's groups of people, right, who have their own gods, who have specific gods. So specific peoples or nations each have their own set of gods or deities. So the Greeks have specifically Greek gods, the Egyptians have specifically Egyptian gods. And so Hegel's account here of religion, it follows a pattern which is quite similar or parallel to the account he wants to give of the development of world history. The notion of the divine that a people develops, according to Hegel, is naturally going to be a reflection of its own values, its own culture, and its own self-conception. Right? And so you can think of this as whatever a given people can think of as being the highest or the grandest, the most sublime at that given point in history. Well, that's represented in their religion. That's their conception of the divine. But this means that those conceptions, of course, are going to be culturally and historically conditioned. One silly example I use sometimes to illustrate this to my students is think of an older science fiction film that you've seen, perhaps, and think of how the writers at that time tried to imagine how the future would look. Right? What would it be like if we had this fantastic technology? We could do anything at all, right? And then compare that with what we have today. Very often we sort of laugh at those old films, right? Remember, like, Captain Kirk with the communicator, right? I mean, at the time when that was written, probably back in the 50s or 60s, whenever that show was on, right? That was just a grand idea of what technology could do one day. Talk to the starship on the communicator from the planet, right? Whereas today, I think just the crudest form of cell phone you can buy for $10 far surpasses the communicator, right? This shows us something about the contingency of the human imagination, right? It's fixed in a certain time and place historically. And so from this, it follows, according to Hegel, that the conception of the divine, which indeed constitutes a part of culture, is going to be in a certain sense, a reflection of that given people. And so through their different cultural artifacts, the way he puts it, the people, a given people objectifies itself to itself, right? So you're producing some external thing and viewing it, and that is a reflection of what you are as a culture. And the conception of the gods is one such artifact. So from this analysis, I think it's clear why Hegel thinks that a historical study of the concrete religions is quite important. And he explains that the goal isn't to study religions in history, to see how these different historical peoples characterize the divinities, and to understand that as a function, then, of how they conceived of themselves, that is, what they thought it amount to be human. Now, given this, that the conception of the divine reflects and corresponds to a people's conception of itself, it seems clear that this self-conception then is historically mutable and needs to be traced through time, and then this is something that gives his analysis this historical dimension. Now, there's, of course, another set of lectures, his lectures on the philosophy of history, a similar story, student notes which were collected and published posthumously. In these lectures, Hegel traces the story of human history in terms of one people and after another. I'm sure some of you have read some of this. The key thesis there that he tries to defend, that everybody sort of recites to themselves, is, okay, the development of human history is the realization of human freedom. So through the course of time, humanity is becoming more and more free. Okay, I mean, any undergraduate can recite that for you, but what does it mean, right? This is, of course, the big question. Lots that have been written about this. My short version is something like this. Forget for a moment the idea of freedom. That can mean many different things, as every good politician knows, right? Think of concepts such as individuality or subjectivity. That's the kind of thing he's talking about. What he's trying to trace there is a historical movement which begins with a time where individuals were subordinated to custom, to tradition, standard ways of doing things, and that there was no recognition of the value of the individual. And so it's only through the course of history, Hegel wants to say, that this conception of individuality starts to be recognized and starts to gain ground. And so I think that's the kind of thing, you can talk, there's an element of freedom involved in that, of course, to what it is to be free. That's, we think today it has something to do with what it is as, what we are as individuals, of course, but I think it's a clear way to think about it. And so the idea is that in the past, these traditional customs were oppressive. People were simply obliged to go along with things because, well, that was what the family, the tribe, the state, whoever, simply dictated. It didn't matter what the individual thought, if they were inclined to do it or not. It didn't matter. Your opinion is not asked. You simply do it. This is your role. This is the realm of what Hegel calls Sittlichkeit, and this is a German word that just means for Hegel the larger sphere of customs and traditions that he thinks people were subordinate to. And Hegel's own term is subjective freedom, right? This development of the individual that I think is more intuitive to us today, where gradually through the course of history, it's realized that each and every human being is valuable and important on their own, that there's something irreducible about the individual. And this realm of subjectivity, of individuality, is something that only comes to be recognized in the course of history. Here it's helpful to think of things like the idea of human rights, right? Human rights is not something that was there at the beginning of history, right? And so this is an idea. It's a concept that developed, took a long time to develop and to refine. Think of things like the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen or the United Nations Charters. Right? These are documents which reflect a certain conception of what it is to be a human being, right? And that celebrate a certain form of irreducibility of what it is to be an individual. In earlier times, of course, that conception was not present, I mean, not in that articulated way. And this is the kind of thing Hegel has in mind. Or if you want to turn the point around, look at it on the negative side, Hegel's quite critical of a number of different institutions historically, which he thinks have stood in the way of the development of human freedom or individuality. So he's quite critical of, for example, the Indian caste system. He's critical of the slave trade. He's critical of the anti-Semitic laws in the Prussia of his own day, which exclude Jews from certain legal rights. So all of these things are, to his mind, in complete contradiction to the principle of subjective freedom, because they undermine the dignity and absolute value of the individual. Right, so the long story Hegel wants to tell about the development of subjective freedom in his lectures on the philosophy of history is, and you can see, intimately connected with the story he wants to tell about the development of world religions in his lectures on the philosophy of religion. So the culture and the self-conception of a people, it's going to be limited by its degree of, in his words, freedom or individuality, subjectivity that it's achieved, its awareness of that. Since the culture or self-conception is constitutive of a conception of the divine in any given people, it therefore follows that the notion of freedom, individuality, subjectivity, it's also bound up with the way in which the gods are conceived. Well, that's the theory. Let's go and look at some examples, and hopefully this will become a bit more intuitive. We saw that Hegel begins in his categorization with what he's calling the religions of nature. One of the religions of nature is Hinduism. What do we see in Hinduism? The conception of the god Brahma, who is the creative power of nature. And anything in nature can be perceived of as having this power. And so this reason the Hindus worship all sorts of natural objects, like the river Ganges. They worship different plants, they worship animals, all of which are thought to have this divine element in them because they have the force of nature within them. There's seemingly infinite number of avatars or manifestations of the abstract divine. Here we have the sacred cow, or Hanuman, the monkey god, one of the heroes of the Ramayana. Another of the religions of nature is Zoroastrianism, the religion of the ancient Persians. The Zoroastrians worshipped as a divinity light or fire. And so they had fire altars that were central to their religious ceremonies. And again, very straightforward why Hegel thinks this is a natural religion, right? Light and fire, these are products of nature. They're not the product of the human mind. Right? They're out there, that we can find them in nature. So we have two examples of what he talks about in terms of natural religion. Then we move to his conception of the Egyptian religions, which he thinks is a transitory religion. It moves us away from the natural religion and into the religions of spirit. And he thinks that, he gives us lots of examples of why he thinks this is transitory. One of these has to do with the Egyptian conception of the immortality of the soul, which he thinks is absolutely a key moment in the development of religious thought. And he illustrates that with images like this. This is the papyrus known as the Book of the Dead by Hunefer. And yeah, what's going on here? Right, we have the Osiris, right, the god of the dead, sitting on the right on the throne. Here on the left, we have, I guess this is supposed to be read from left to right, we have the god of the underworld, Anubis, right, with the head of a dog who's leading in the dead guy, right? And then in the next scene, we see Anubis is weighing on the scales the heart of the dead guy against a feather. And so the idea is if you have a very heavy heart, then you are a morally wretched person, right, and you lose. You don't get to enter the realm of the dead. If that's the case, then this other god here was the head of like a crocodile and the body partly of a hippopotamus. Amot, he will eat the heart, and that person, his soul dies, as the heart is thought to be the locus of the soul. Then we have the god Thoth with the head of an ibis. He's writing down what's happening, right? Recording the guy's name and whatever, social security number, making sure we have the right person here. And it looks like he passes the test because you can see him then he's being led by the god Horus into the realm of the dead here. And yeah, what's Hegel's point with this kind of a story? He's saying that the idea of judging people for their moral worth and holding them responsible for their actions implies a developed conception of individuality. Individuals and their moral decisions are now thought to have an importance and value that he thinks was not formally recognized. So the moral life of each individual person is important enough in this sense to warrant its own legal proceedings. It's important enough that it even interests the gods. Right? Now suddenly the moral life of individuals, there's an enormous importance which accrues to this. And Hegel thinks that the intuitive ideas that we have today about justice, about morality, about individual freedom, he thinks all of this can be traced back in part to this original Egyptian conception of immortality. He thinks all of that arises here for the first time. Another important characteristic of the Egyptian gods is that they're mixed entities, right? That they contain a human element and an animal element. The Egyptian divinities, they're not purely gods of nature like the sacred cow of the Hindus or the light of the Persians. There's an element of the animal present, but now for the first time there's also a human element which is introduced into it and mixed together with it. One can find all sorts of examples of the sort of thing Hegel's talking about here. His favorite example is probably that of the Sphinx. Right? What's a Sphinx? Right? The body of a lion and the head of a human being. Right? But most of the Egyptian deities reverse this. They have a human body and then the head of some kind of an animal. So, for example, the sun god Ra is represented with the head of a hawk. Here we have Sobek with the head of a crocodile, Khnum, the head of a ram. This is also true of the many female deities that we have in Egyptian religion. Here we have the female deity Sekhmet, who has the head of a lion. There's also Bastet, who has the head of a cat, and Tauret, who has the head of a hippopotamus. Hegel also discusses, on this motif of mixed figures, one of the most famous of the Egyptian gods, Anubis, right, we saw before, is the body of a human being, the head of a jackal. And since Anubis is said to have created important aspect of human affairs, such as science or the art of mummification, we would have expected him to have a completely anthropomorphic form, right? After all, it's only human beings who have science, right? But this is not the way he's depicted. He's depicted with the head of a dog. And so Hegel's way of reading this is that the Egyptians, they've recognized a certain aspect of this as being divine, but it's still bound up with nature somehow. We can find a similar oddity in the deity Thoth. This is the god who has the head of an ibis, right, the body of a man. Thoth is said to be the inventor of hieroglyphics, and he's the god of writing and wisdom. So here we can see he's writing something on the tablet. And once again, given this, we would expect this god also to have a fully human appearance, since it's only humans, after all, who have writing. And thus it's odd that he has the head of an ibis and that sometimes he's portrayed as a baboon. So according to Hegel, the Egyptians have reached a level where they regard certain human activities as divine, but they've not yet regarded these things as entirely the work of the human mind or the human spirit. That natural element is still attached to them. And so for Hegel, the importance of these mixed figures is that they arise at a time when there's a conception of spirit, a certain conception of spirit, which corresponds to a certain conception of the divine. The Egyptians have begun to attain a level, according to him, where their self-conception allows them to conceive of the divine as a self-conscious subject. And it's for this reason that their deities have certain human characteristics. And therefore, there's a need to move away from the representations of the divine in terms of animals or other objects of nature. And this is important for Hegel, as this then marks that transition from the religions of nature to what Hegel calls the religions of spirit. This moves us to then the Greek religion, right? Greek polytheism, which is one of the religions of spirit. Hegel argues that we have the same movement here that we saw from nature to spirit, which takes place not just at this broad level of the different world religions as they progress historically, but also within the individual world religions. Kind of a funny thought, but his point here is that we can see the Greek religion itself going through those same stages that we just traced. And so this means, if you want to look at it this way, whatever criticisms he has of the Asian religions, he also has of the Greek religions at an earlier stage. So according to Greek mythology, as we know it by, for example, Hesiod, we have the first generation of the gods, right, which was produced by chaos and was rather limited. And then after this first generation, comes a larger group known as the Titans, who are the offspring of Gaia, right, the goddess of the earth, and Uranus, the goddess of heaven, the god of heaven, right? So everything between earth and heaven is, right, the universe. And so according to Hegel, these earlier gods represent gods of nature. They're natural forces primarily. From the Titans then come the well-known generation of the Olympians, right, who are led by Zeus. The Olympians for Hegel represent gods not of nature, but of spirit. The shift from the Titans to the Olympians is portrayed mythologically as a war of the gods. Hegel recalls the myth, again portrayed in Hesiod, of how the Titans, who were led by Kronos, were overthrown by Zeus in the Olympian gods. So Zeus revolts against his father Kronos and establishes a new reign. The War of the Gods represents symbolically a movement from nature to spirit. So the old gods of nature are supplanted by the new Olympian gods, which are far more anthropomorphic. I think you can see this immediately if you know anything at all about Greek mythology and you just read through these names. You can usually associate something, some kind of an idea or personality or in a story with the Olympians, whereas these other ones, it's a little bit hazier, right? That they don't seem to have that same degree of personification. They don't have developed personalities or individualities in quite the same way. Hegel gives us several examples of how this shift in focus from nature to spirit is seen in the conception of individual gods. He points out that the Olympians maintain some of the natural powers, like the Titans, but then new powers, significantly new powers, are added to reflect the development of spirit or human culture. So, for example, Zeus is like Uranus in that he's still responsible for weather phenomena like rain, thunder, lightning, things like that, but he surpasses Uranus because he gets new qualities. He's responsible for the state and for civic life as human culture. So the Titans represent merely these natural forces and not yet more developed individual personalities. This is also the case with the god Oceanus, who was merely, right, he's from the earlier group of gods from the Titans, who represents the symbol for the force of the sea. By contrast, the analogous god among the Olympians, that is Poseidon, has other characteristics that transcend the merely natural power. In addition to being the wild force of the sea, like his predecessor, Poseidon also has qualities associated with human life and culture. For example, the building or construction or the breeding of horses. The comparison of these two generations of gods represents for Hegel symbolically, right, the movement of religion from natural religion to spirit. And here I think you can see, if you look at some of the images, the ancient images, you can see the kind of thing that Hegel is talking about. For example, here in this mosaic, you see a strange image, right? We have Poseidon riding the chariot through the waves, right? Strange image. It's the fish swimming around. And below him, we have Oceanus and his wife Tethys. And look at the way in which these divinities are portrayed. You look at Poseidon, he looks like a Greek warrior, right? A strong guy. Has mastered certain elements of human culture, right? He's riding a chariot, human technology. He's trained horses, right? Down below here with Oceanus, this is not the case, right? First off, he's in this subordinate position, right? He's been exiled into limbus, right, in the fringes, right? He's no longer plays a significant role, but look at the way in which he's portrayed. His lower body, actually not in the picture, is that of a fish. You have this eel or serpent thing sort of wandering along, and if you look on his head, he has the head of the claws of a crab or a lobster or something like that. He's still nature, right? He's not quite made it to a fully human or anthropomorphic conception. He's still bound up with that nature, that natural conception. Yeah, another example that Hegel gives of how the Greeks have advanced beyond the realm of nature is their use of animals as symbols. And here, we can compare the different images that we've seen before with the religions that Hegel's traced so far. So just recall those images that we've looked at before. We have the sacred cow of the Hindus, where the animals themselves are something sacred. Or for the Egyptians, we had like the god of Horus, who has like the head of a hawk or a falcon. There's a mixed image, right? And so there's something sacred about the human and the animal, right? They're both together. Now compare those images to these. Right? Now something entirely different is going on here. We have Zeus, who's entirely anthropomorphic. He looks like a human being, but what's happened, right? The animal is reduced. The animal has become a sidekick, a mascot, a symbol. Right? He has he's portrayed with the eagle. So according to Hegel's story, the bird has gone from being a full-blown deity to a symbol in the course of the development of time. In parallel to that development, it's the human form which has emerged as a form of the divine. And this is not just sort of happenstance. I didn't just pick these examples. You can find these all over Greek mythology. Here you have Athena, who has the owl, Aphrodite, the sparrow. The other Greek gods and goddesses have their favorite animals as symbols as well. We saw Poseidon with the horse. We can also make the case that we can see a vestige of this even in the gospel writers, right, who are also portrayed with animal symbols. We have another contrast that Hegel makes with the Greeks and Asian religion in terms of the goddess Artemis, or Diana. He goes back and forth between the Greek and Roman designation. This doesn't matter. Here he writes, the Diana of Ephesus is still Asiatic and is represented with many breasts and covered with images of animals. She has, in fact, as the basis of her character, natural life, the producing and nourishing power of nature. On the other hand, Diana of the Greeks is the huntress who kills animals. The worship of Artemis originated in Ephesus in Asia Minor, so modern-day Turkey, right, where her temple was celebrated throughout the ancient world. This cult was then later brought to Greece, where the conception of this deity was then reconceived. And so for Hegel, it makes sense, according to the narrative he wants to tell, that this Asian Artemis, if you will, is portrayed in this way, that she's associated with nature, right? She's wearing animal skins. She's continuous with nature. She has multiple breasts, right? It makes her look a little bit odd, but the symbolism's clear, right? She's the nourishing, natural goddess who is looking out for all of the animals, right? You see the different animal heads below, she's presumably protecting. Now, we contrast that to the Greek Artemis down there. We're in a completely different world, right? The Greek Artemis is, again, completely anthropomorphic, right? It looks just like a human being, it looks like a woman, right? And here, instead of nurturing nature, right? What's Artemis? She's the hunter, right? She is dominating nature. She's getting ready to kill this deer that she's just caught, right? She is superior to nature. And the natural has lost the sacred status here. Yeah, another example that Hegel uses to illustrate his point has to do with the comparison and contrast between Egypt and the Greeks. So take the pyramids. What are the pyramids, right? Of course, we all know they play an important religious functions. The pyramids were the great funeral monuments to pharaohs. They're intended to facilitate the journey of the pharaoh's spirit to the world of the dead. And the deceased pharaoh, however, is not something who's accessible to religious believers, but rather he's cut off from them by a series of different sarcophagi than the pyramid itself. For Hegel, this represents a form of religious alienation. Let me explain what he means by that, just by a comparison with Greek architecture. When one thinks about the Parthenon and other public temples or sanctuaries on the Acropolis at Athens, they're open and accessible, inviting the citizen to come and enter. Right? They're elaborately decorated precisely in order to be viewed from the outside. These structures are located in prominent places where the citizens came together and met to attend to public public business. Right? They, in a certain sense, beckon the visitor to approach. And so the building of the Parthenon played an important role here, primarily to showcase the great sculpture of the patron deity Athena, right, which was made accessible to the Greeks on festival days. Also, the image is shown on Greek coins. So for Hegel, what the Greek mind is all about here is transparency. Right? It's simply showing immediately the divine without anything hidden or mysterious. These great monuments are intended to show things and not to hide things. Think of this in contrast to the Egyptians, right? After the completion of the pyramids, right, the entrances are sealed and hidden from view. We tend to forget this, right? We're used to seeing all these great shows about Egypt on Discovery Channel or something, right, where they take you inside the pyramid. But that's the mystery. You weren't supposed to ever see that stuff, right? The thing was closed off, right? The only thing that the average religious believer or whatever, the devotee could see was from the outside, right? And there, on the outside of the pyramids, there's nothing striking or ornamental about it, apart from these massive size, right? By contrast, the Parthenon is elaborately decorated with these detailed friezes depicting scenes of Greek mythology. The visitors enjoined to stop to contemplate those depictions at length. So indeed, one needs to come up close in order to see them properly. And so the idea for Hegel is that the monuments for the Egyptians are intended not to reveal or to clarify, to explain something, but rather to hide something within. It's all about a mystery or an enigma that you're left to sort of puzzle about afterwards. Whereas for the Greek mind, according to Hegel, has sort of reached this point of realization of what spirit is, and that's why it's able to make this transparent to people. There's nothing that's mysterious about it. Now, there's a somewhat odd result that comes from this analysis, which I suggested at the beginning. Although Hegel's stated goal here is to demonstrate the truth of Christianity, in fact, his methodology demonstrates something that's quite different, namely that the different religions of the world all have certain common features in the course of their development. The Greek religion runs through the same developmental pattern as the religions of nature. And moreover, there are still vestiges of the religions of nature even in Christianity. So this means that there's no one religion which has a monopoly on truth. Instead, religion is a fundamental aspect of the human experience, and truth can be found in all religious traditions. In this sense, Hegel can be said to anticipate the modern movement that we know today as comparative theology, which attempts to compare various doctrines and dogmas across different religions in order to determine their commonalities or differences. This movement thus believes, for example, that Christian truths can be found in Buddhist or Hindu texts and vice versa. Now, some might say that this is reading Hegel against his own goals and intentions, and yeah, I'm open to this criticism. I can acknowledge that to a certain degree, but I don't feel like I'm doing violence to the text with this reading, because I think this is, if you read the text, you see what he's doing methodologically, this is what he's saying. Although, to be sure, there's a lot in Hegel's lectures that we should reject, even condemn, but I also think there's a lot that's intriguing and insightful, especially in our modern globalized world, which is so fraught with religious prejudice, misunderstanding, and conflict. I think he's still got a valuable message for us. Religious belief and practice are a universal part of the human experience that we can't escape. And this is an experience that we all share, regardless of what denomination we personally belong to. And so Hegel's plea is that it's not that, as often thought, we should simply stand back and celebrate Christianity as the truest and best religion to the exclusion of everything else. Instead, I think his view, which maintains its relevance for us today, is rather that, I have this quotation here, in every religion there is a divine presence, a divine relation. And philosophy has to seek out the spiritual element in the most different forms. Right? And so his idea is, he often uses the metaphor of a plant, right? The plant being humanity, which is growing in different ways, right? And so, although you can look at different aspects of the plant, say the seed or the stalk or the leaf or whatever, and they look very, very different, the way religions look very different, instead they're a part of the same organic growth the same way humanity is an organic growth. I think those are the kind of images that are useful. So the point is that for Hegel, there's a truth in all religions, and if we can take the right philosophical approach, then we can learn to recognize them. And I think this is a valuable lesson that he can share with us today in our modern globalized world. So I thank you for your attention and interest.